On the 15th of April, 2019, flames erupted from the roof of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The world watched in horror as 900 years of history burned before their eyes. But while cameras focused on the collapsing spire and firefighters battling the inferno, something else was happening in the shadows beneath the cathedral. In those underground chambers, where tourists had never walked and historians were never allowed to venture, ancient vaults were being emptied. Documents were disappearing. And the official story you were told about an accidental fire was being carefully constructed even as the ashes were still falling. 7 centuries earlier, the Knights Templar had walked those same stones. They had knelt in those same chapels. And they had hidden something so dangerous, so explosive, that the Vatican spent generations ensuring it would never be found. These warrior monks didn't just build churches, they buried secrets. The architecture of Notre Dame itself speaks in a language that modern scholars refuse to translate. The mathematical impossibilities in its construction. The hidden chambers that appear on no official maps. The symbols carved into stones that were meant to remain hidden forever. But some truths refuse to stay buried. Some evidence survived the flames. And what emerges from the ashes of Notre Dame will shatter everything you thought you knew about the Knights Templar, the Catholic Church, and the hidden powers that still control our world today. Imagine for a moment that everything you were told about the Notre Dame fire was a carefully constructed lie. That the official story, a restoration accident, faulty wiring, human error, was designed specifically to keep you from asking the questions that matter. You watched the footage. You saw the flames consuming one of humanity's most sacred monuments. You felt the collective grief of millions as the spire collapsed into the inferno. But what you didn't see, what they made absolutely certain you would never see, were the unmarked vehicles that arrived at the cathedral 90 minutes before the first alarm was raised. You didn't see the sealed containers being removed from underground vaults that don't appear on any official map. You didn't see the systematic evacuation of specific artifacts while others were left to burn. And you certainly weren't told that the fire began in 3 separate locations simultaneously, a physical impossibility for an accidental blaze. The fire started at 6:50 in the evening on April 15, 2019. Within minutes, flames were visible from multiple points across the cathedral's roof structure. The official investigation would later claim a single point of origin near the base of the spire. But firefighters on the scene that night told a different story in their initial reports that were quietly amended weeks later. They described fire breaking out in sections of the cathedral that should have been completely isolated from each other. They witnessed flames erupting from sealed chambers that hadn't been accessed during the restoration work. Most disturbing of all, they reported locked doors in the lower levels that had been forced open from the inside, as if someone had been desperate to escape, or desperate to ensure certain areas burned completely. You need to understand the scale of what disappeared that night. Notre Dame housed more than just religious artifacts and tourist attractions. Deep beneath the main cathedral structure, in vaults constructed during the 13th century, there existed an archive that the Catholic Church had protected for over 800 years. These weren't ordinary church records. These were documents that predated the official founding of Notre Dame itself. Manuscripts that chronicled the presence of the Knights Templar in Paris during the peak of their power. Letters, journals, and encoded texts that detailed what the Templars had discovered during their decades in Jerusalem. Financial records that revealed the true extent of their wealth and influence. And most explosive of all, architectural plans that showed the real purpose behind certain chambers built into Notre Dame's foundation. Chambers designed not for worship, but for concealment. The official inventory of lost artifacts is a masterpiece of deliberate vagueness. It lists paintings, sculptures, and religious relics. It mentions damage to the organ and destruction of the roof structure. What it doesn't mention are the 17 sealed containers removed from the cathedral's crypts in the hours immediately following the fire. It doesn't explain why certain vaults, despite being directly beneath the most intense burning, showed no heat damage whatsoever. It doesn't address the eyewitness testimony of cathedral staff who reported seeing unauthorized personnel in restricted areas during the evening of April 14th, a full day before the fire began. And it absolutely refuses to acknowledge the existence of a private collection maintained by the cathedral's highest clergy, a collection that included Templar documents so sensitive that even the Vatican's secret archives wouldn't house them. Here is where the impossibility becomes undeniable. Fire investigators determined that the blaze reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius in certain sections of the roof. At those temperatures, everything should have been reduced to ash. Yet when archaeologists were finally allowed to examine the site weeks later, they found documents in the lower archives that had survived completely intact. Not just survived, they were pristine, as if they had been protected by some kind of advanced fire suppression system. The official explanation was that the stone vaults naturally protected the contents. But multiple experts have gone on record, risking their professional reputations, to state that this explanation is physically impossible. The heat should have penetrated those vaults. The smoke alone should have caused irreparable damage. Instead, certain chambers emerged from the inferno as if they had been deliberately shielded. Now consider the timing. The restoration work on Notre Dame had been ongoing for months before the fire. During that time, researchers had been granted unprecedented access to areas of the cathedral that had been sealed since the 19th century. One team in particular, led by a historian named Philippe Villeneuve, had been documenting architectural anomalies in the cathedral's foundation. Villeneuve had discovered something that contradicted everything historians thought they knew about Notre Dame's construction. He had found evidence that certain chambers beneath the cathedral predated the building itself by at least 2 centuries. These weren't medieval crypts added during construction. These were Templar vaults, built when the Knights still held power in Paris, before their arrest and execution in 1307. Villeneuve was scheduled to present his findings at an international conference in May of 2019. The fire occurred exactly 3 weeks before that presentation. The security footage from that night tells its own story, if you know how to read it. The cathedral's surveillance system captured the entire sequence of events. Or rather, it captured 93% of the events. 7% of the footage covering 3 critical time periods, simply doesn't exist. The official explanation is technical malfunction. 3 separate cameras in 3 different security zones, all experiencing simultaneous technical failures during the exact moments when the fire was spreading most aggressively. The probability of this happening by chance is so astronomically small that even the investigators stopped trying to calculate it. What those missing segments would have shown, we can only infer from the physical evidence left behind. Forced doors.
Disturbé d'archives.
And most tellingly, footprints in areas of the crypt that shouldn't have had any footprints at all. But perhaps the most damning evidence isn't what burned. It's what didn't burn. In the treasury of Notre Dame, there exists a collection of artifacts directly connected to the Knights Templar. These include fragments of correspondence between Templar Grand Masters and French nobility, pieces of the original architectural plans for the temple in Jerusalem, and a series of encoded manuscripts that scholars have been attempting to decipher for over 200 years. Every single one of these artifacts should have been destroyed in the fire. The treasury is located directly beneath the area where the fire burned most intensely. Yet when the smoke cleared and investigators finally entered the treasury, they found something impossible. The Templar collection was gone. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply gone. In its place was a single notation in the inventory log, dated April 14, 2019. The notation read, "Transferred to secure storage for preservation during restoration work." But here is the problem. There is no record of any such transfer being authorized. No documentation of where these artifacts were moved. No signature of the curator who supposedly ordered the transfer. The artifacts had simply vanished into thin air exactly 24 hours before the fire began. You are beginning to see the pattern now. The convenient timing, the impossible physics, the missing evidence, the systematic erasure of anything that might lead to uncomfortable questions. This wasn't a tragic accident that befell one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. This was a calculated operation designed to accomplish 2 objectives simultaneously. First, to remove evidence that the Catholic Church had been protecting for 8 centuries. Evidence that would fundamentally alter our understanding of the Knights Templar and their true mission. Second, to create a narrative of destruction so emotionally overwhelming that no one would think to question what was really happening beneath the surface. While the world mourned the loss of Notre Dame, while donations poured in for reconstruction, while politicians promised to rebuild the cathedral exactly as it had been, the real work was being accomplished in silence. The secrets were being moved, the evidence was being sanitized, and the truth was being buried under layers of official narrative and collective grief. Notre Dame de Paris began construction in 1163. That is the date you will find in every history book, every tourist guide, every official document about the cathedral. But that date is a lie. Or more precisely, it is a carefully selected truth designed to conceal a much older and far more disturbing reality. When workers broke ground for the cathedral's foundation, they weren't starting from nothing. They were building on top of something that had already existed for decades. Something that the Knights Templar had constructed during the height of their power in Paris. Something that was never meant to be discovered. The Templars arrived in Paris in 1129, 34 years before Notre Dame's official construction date. They established their primary French headquarters in the Marais district, but their influence extended far beyond that single compound. Throughout the city, they acquired properties, built fortifications, and most importantly, they dug. The soil beneath Paris is honeycombed with tunnels and chambers that predate the modern city by centuries. Some of these underground structures are well documented: the ancient Roman quarries, medieval crypts, and 18th-century catacombs. But there exists another layer, deeper and far more secretive, that official historians refuse to acknowledge. These are the Templar vaults, and they connect directly to the site where Notre Dame now stands. In 1965, during routine maintenance work on the cathedral's foundation, engineers discovered something that should have been impossible. Behind a section of wall in the lowest crypt, sealed with masonry that didn't match the surrounding stonework, they found a passageway descending another 20 meters into bedrock. The architectural style of this passage was unmistakably 12th century, but the techniques used in its construction suggested knowledge that shouldn't have existed in medieval Europe. The stones were cut with precision that medieval tools couldn't achieve. The tunnel walls showed evidence of mathematical calculations in their proportions that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance. Most disturbing of all, the passage led to a chamber that predated Notre Dame's construction by at least 3 decades. The discovery was immediately classified. The engineers were sworn to secrecy, and the passage was sealed again, this time with modern concrete reinforced with steel bars. But one of those engineers, a man named Jean-Baptiste Lassus, couldn't let it go. He spent the next 15 years of his life quietly researching the Templars' presence in Paris. He analyzed medieval property records, studied architectural plans, and interviewed elderly cathedral workers who remembered rumors passed down through generations. What Lassus discovered was a pattern. Notre Dame wasn't simply built on a Templar site, it was built according to a Templar design. The cathedral's floor plan, when overlaid with known Templar architectural principles, revealed proportions and measurements that appear nowhere else in Gothic architecture. The placement of certain pillars corresponded to mathematical ratios that the Templars had learned during their time in Jerusalem. The orientation of specific chapels aligned with astronomical calculations that medieval Christian builders had no reason to know or use. Notre Dame was hiding Templar knowledge in plain sight, encoded into its very structure. The mathematics become even more extraordinary when you examine the cathedral's dimensions. The main nave measures exactly 128 meters in length. The width at the transept is 48 meters. The height to the vault is 33 meters. These are not random measurements. They form perfect ratios that appear repeatedly in Templar architecture throughout Europe. The ratio of length to width is 8:3, a proportion that the Templars used in every major structure they built. The height corresponds to specific astronomical cycles that the ancient world understood but medieval Europe had supposedly forgotten. Someone designed Notre Dame to be a physical manifestation of sacred geometry, and that someone had access to knowledge that shouldn't have existed in 12th century Paris. Here is where the evidence becomes undeniable. In the cathedral's southern tower, there exists a chamber known as the Bell Tower Archives. For 800 years, this room housed documents related to the cathedral's construction and maintenance. In 2003, during a digitization project, archivists discovered a set of architectural plans that had been misfiled and forgotten for centuries. These plans, drawn on parchment and dated to 1160, showed the cathedral's layout in extraordinary detail. But they also showed something else, a series of underground chambers beneath the main structure that don't appear in any other architectural record. The plans are annotated in Latin, but certain key measurements and directions are written in a different language entirely. A language that scholars eventually identified as a Templar cipher, used by the order for their most sensitive communications. The cipher has never been fully decoded, but what little has been translated is explosive. The annotations refer to the preservation of sacred knowledge and the protection of the divine secret. They mention chambers built for eternity and vaults that must survive the fall. Most chillingly, they contain a date, 1307. That is the year when King Philip IV of France ordered the arrest and execution of the Knights Templar throughout his kingdom. It is the year when the order was officially destroyed. But these architectural plans, created 147 years earlier, anticipated that destruction. Someone knew, even in 1160, that the Templars would eventually fall. And someone made sure that their most important secrets would be protected long after their order ceased to exist. The physical evidence supports this theory in ways that are impossible to dismiss. In 1989, during renovations for Notre Dame's 825th anniversary, workers discovered a series of marks carved into stones in the lowest foundation level. These marks were not decorative elements or construction signatures. They were directional indicators, arrows pointing toward specific locations beneath the cathedral. Following these indicators led to the discovery of 3 sealed chambers that had been completely hidden from view for over 8 centuries. The chambers contained no religious artifacts, no church records, nothing that would normally be found in a cathedral crypt. Instead, they held stone boxes sealed with lead and wax, containers designed to protect their contents from moisture, decay, and time itself. The official record states that these boxes were empty when discovered. But 3 cathedral workers who were present during the opening have told a very different story. They describe manuscripts wrapped in oiled cloth, still legible after 800 years. They recall symbols and diagrams that made no sense in the context of medieval Christianity. And they remember the immediate arrival of Vatican officials who seized the contents and threatened anyone who spoke about what they had seen with excommunication and legal prosecution. Those 3 workers were transferred to different positions, their access to the cathedral's lower levels permanently revoked. The sealed chambers were filled with concrete. And the official excavation report makes no mention of anything being found except empty stone boxes and historical curiosity. You begin to understand now why Notre Dame was so important, why its construction was funded by the most powerful nobles in France, why the Catholic Church invested enormous resources in maintaining and protecting it for 8 centuries. This wasn't just a cathedral, it was a time capsule. It was the Templars' insurance policy against their own destruction. They knew they were accumulating too much power, too much wealth, too much knowledge. They understood that eventually, the forces arrayed against them would succeed in dismantling their order. So they built something that would outlast them. They encoded their secrets into the architecture of a building so sacred, so central to Christianity, that no one would dare destroy it. They hid their most dangerous knowledge in vaults so deep, so well concealed, that it would take centuries before anyone even suspected they existed. And then, on April 15, 2019, someone decided those secrets had stayed hidden long enough. Someone realized that modern archaeological techniques and ground-penetrating radar were getting too sophisticated. Someone understood that it was only a matter of time before researchers like Philippe Villeneuve confirmed what the Templars had done. So the fire wasn't about destroying Notre Dame. It was about destroying the evidence beneath it. While the world watched the roof burn, while firefighters battled to save the structure, the real operation was happening underground. The vaults were being emptied. The chambers were being sealed permanently. And 800 years of Templar secrets were being erased from history, one carefully controlled burn at a time. His name was Marcel Dubois, and on September 12, 1973, he made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dubois was a restoration worker, employed by the French Ministry of Culture to conduct structural assessments of Notre Dame's aging infrastructure. His job was mundane, measuring stone erosion, testing mortar strength, documenting water damage in the lower crypts. Nobody expected him to find anything more interesting than crumbling masonry and medieval graffiti. But on that September morning, while examining a wall in the cathedral's deepest accessible level, Dubois noticed something that his 40 years of experience told him was wrong. The mortar between certain stones was a different color than the surrounding sections, and when he tapped the wall with his assessment hammer, he heard an echo that indicated empty space beyond. Dubois did what any curious craftsman would do. He carefully removed several stones to investigate. Behind the false wall, he found a narrow passage descending at a steep angle into darkness. The passage walls were dry, despite being below the water table of the Seine River. The air that emerged was stale but breathable, suggesting the space had been sealed but not completely airtight. Using his work lantern, Dubois descended approximately 15 meters before the passage opened into a small chamber, no more than 3 meters square. The chamber contained a single object, a wooden chest reinforced with iron bands, sealed with wax that still bore the impression of a symbol Dubois didn't recognize at the time. Later analysis would confirm it was the seal of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, executed in 1314. What Dubois found inside that chest has been the subject of speculation, denial, and deliberate misinformation for over 50 years. The official record states that the chest contained routine church documents from the 13th century, property deeds, correspondence between bishops, nothing of historical significance. But Dubois told a very different story to his family and close friends before his death in 2008. He described manuscripts written in multiple languages, including Latin, Old French, and texts he couldn't identify. He recalled elaborate diagrams showing architectural plans, astronomical calculations, and what appeared to be maps of Jerusalem and surrounding regions. Most importantly, he remembered one document in particular, a letter addressed to future generations, written by Templar Knights shortly before their order's destruction, detailing the truth of what they had discovered in the Holy Land. Dubois photographed the contents of the chest using his personal camera before reporting his discovery to his supervisors. Those photographs were confiscated within hours of his filing the official discovery report. He was told that the materials were being transferred to the National Archives for proper preservation and study. When Dubois asked about accessing the materials for his own research, he was informed that the documents had been classified as sensitive religious artifacts and placed under Vatican jurisdiction. He would never see them again. His security clearance for Notre Dame's lower levels was immediately revoked. His contract with the Ministry of Culture was terminated 3 months later under the pretext of budget cuts. And when he attempted to publish his account of the discovery in 1976, he received a visit from 2 Vatican officials who made it abundantly clear that speaking publicly about what he had found would have severe consequences. But Dubois had made copies. Before turning over his photographs, he had spent one night printing duplicates in his home darkroom. He stored these copies in a safety deposit box at a Paris bank, telling only his eldest son about their existence. After Dubois's death, his son attempted to publish the photographs online. Within 48 hours, the images were removed from every platform where they appeared. The son's bank account was frozen pending investigation of unspecified financial irregularities, and when he persisted in trying to share the images, he was charged with possession of stolen church property and threatened with prosecution under French antiquities laws. The charges were eventually dropped, but only after he signed a legally binding agreement never to discuss or distribute the photographs again. Only 3 of Dubois's photographs have ever surfaced publicly, leaked anonymously to a French archaeology forum in 2015. These images show portions of a manuscript written in elegant medieval Latin. The visible text discusses knowledge carried from Solomon's temple and the sacred geometry of divine creation. It references bloodlines preserved and truths that must survive the purification. Most intriguingly, it contains precise astronomical data describing planetary movements and eclipse cycles that medieval Europeans should not have been able to calculate with such accuracy. The manuscript also includes a schematic diagram of what appears to be the layout of Notre Dame's foundation, drawn over 100 years before the cathedral was officially constructed. This single detail confirms what architectural historians have long suspected but been unable to prove. The Templars designed Notre Dame before it was built. The implications of what Du Bois discovered are staggering. If the manuscripts were authentic, and every qualified expert who has examined the leaked photographs agrees that they show genuine 13th-century parchment and ink, then the Knights Templar possessed knowledge far beyond what conventional history attributes to them. They understood astronomy at a level not achieved in Europe until the 16th century. They had detailed architectural plans for a cathedral that wouldn't be constructed until after their order's dissolution. They claimed to have discovered something in Jerusalem of such importance that it justified creating an elaborate system of hidden vaults and encoded messages to preserve it for future generations. And they explicitly stated that this knowledge had to be protected from the very church they ostensibly served. The letter that Du Bois described in his private journals is perhaps the most explosive element of his discovery. According to his account, the letter was dated March 13, 1307. Exactly 6 months before King Philip IV ordered the mass arrest of all Templars in France. The letter's authors, for senior Templar knights whose names Du Bois recorded, wrote with the certainty of men who knew their doom was approaching. They described a conspiracy within the highest levels of the Catholic Church to destroy their order and seize their wealth. They claimed that Pope Clement V had been coerced into supporting this conspiracy through threats and blackmail. And they stated explicitly that the true reason for their persecution was not heresy or financial jealousy. It was knowledge. Knowledge that threatened the very foundations of church authority and Christian doctrine. What knowledge could possibly be so dangerous that it required the complete destruction of the most powerful military order in medieval Europe? The letter provided hints but no explicit answers. It referenced the true of the divine bloodline and evidence that contradicts the sacred narrative. It mentioned documents recovered from beneath the Temple Mount and proof of what was hidden by the Council of Nicaea. For those familiar with Templar mythology and conspiracy theories, these phrases suggest a familiar and explosive possibility: that the Templars had discovered evidence contradicting official church teachings about the life and divinity of Jesus Christ. Perhaps evidence of descendants of hidden gospels, of a historical reality fundamentally different from theological doctrine. Du Bois became obsessed with understanding what he had found. He spent years researching Templar history, studying medieval manuscripts, and attempting to decode the symbols and diagrams he had photographed. His personal notes, preserved by his family, reveal a man descending into a kind of scholarly madness. He filled notebooks with calculations attempting to match the astronomical data from the manuscripts with known historical events. He drew elaborate connection maps linking Templar properties throughout France. He became convinced that the hidden chambers beneath Notre Dame were merely one node in a larger network of secret repositories scattered across Europe. And he believed, until his death, that what he had discovered in 1973 was only a small fraction of what the Templars had hidden. The tragedy of Marcel Du Bois is that he died knowing a truth he could never prove. The photographs were confiscated. The manuscripts disappeared into Vatican archives. His credibility was systematically destroyed by officials who portrayed him as a delusional amateur seeking attention. Even his own family began to doubt his account, worn down by years of harassment and legal threats. When he died at age 83, his obituary made no mention of his discovery. It described him simply as a skilled craftsman who had worked on many of France's historic buildings. The truth of what he found, and what was taken from him, was buried along with him. But before he died, Du Bois made one final statement to his son. He said that what he had found in that sealed chamber proved beyond any doubt that the fire of 2019 was not an accident. Someone knew the secrets were there, and someone decided it was finally time to make absolutely certain they would never be revealed. Dr. Catherine Moreau defended her doctoral thesis on Templar architecture at the Sorbonne in 1992. Her research focused on the mathematical proportions found in buildings constructed or influenced by the Knights Templar throughout medieval Europe. It was groundbreaking work, meticulously documented, peer-reviewed, and praised by her academic committee. She was offered a prestigious position at the French National Center for Scientific Research, with unlimited access to historical archives and generous funding for her continued investigations. Her future in academia seemed limitless. Then she made the mistake of asking questions about Notre Dame. Within 18 months, her career was destroyed, her reputation shattered, and her research buried under accusations of academic fraud that she could never effectively refute. Moreau's fatal error was recognizing a pattern that other scholars had either missed or deliberately ignored. While cataloging Templar architectural features across France, she noticed that certain proportions and measurements appeared repeatedly in buildings that supposedly had no connection to the order. Churches constructed decades after the Templars' dissolution contained the same mathematical ratios found in confirmed Templar structures. Most significantly, Notre Dame de Paris exhibited these proportions more extensively than any other building she had studied. The cathedral's dimensions, the placement of its pillars, the angles of its flying buttresses, everything suggested a comprehensive architectural plan rooted in Templar sacred geometry. Moreau proposed a revolutionary theory, that Templar architectural knowledge had been deliberately preserved and incorporated into major religious buildings long after the order's official destruction. Her research led her to request access to Notre Dame's architectural archives, specifically documents from the cathedral's earliest construction phases. The request was approved without issue. She spent 6 months examining 13th-century building records, payment ledgers, and correspondence between the cathedral's builders and various medieval authorities. What she found was extraordinary. References to consultations with unnamed advisors described only as masters of the sacred arts. Payments made to craftsmen for work on hidden foundations that don't appear in the official construction timeline. And most damning, a series of encoded notations in the margins of construction documents that used the same cipher system found in authenticated Templar manuscripts. Moreau was documenting proof that Templars or their immediate successors had directly influenced Notre Dame's construction. She presented her preliminary findings at an international conference on medieval architecture in Lyon in March of 1994. The response from her colleagues was immediate and hostile. Senior historians dismissed her work as speculative conspiracy theory. Church officials attending the conference called her research offensive to Christian heritage. Several prominent academics walked out during her presentation. But the harshest criticism came from her own department chair at the Sorbonne, who publicly stated that Moreau had abandoned scholarly rigor in pursuit of sensationalism. Within weeks, she received official notification that her access to Notre Dame's archives had been permanently revoked due to unspecified violations of research protocols. The systematic destruction of Catherine Moreau's career provides a template for understanding what happens to scholars who get too close to the truth about Notre Dame. First came the academic isolation. Colleagues who had praised her work suddenly refused to collaborate or even acknowledge her research. Then the funding disappeared. Her grants were not renewed, with vague explanations about budget constraints and shifting research priorities. Publications that had accepted her papers suddenly rejected them after further review. Conference invitations were rescinded. Students were discouraged from working with her. Within 2 years of her Lyon presentation, Moreau found herself completely shut out of academic circles that had once celebrated her potential. But Catherine Moreau was not the first scholar to suffer this fate, nor would she be the last. In 1987, 7 years before Moreau's troubles began, a Belgian archaeologist named Henri Devereux had conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys around Notre Dame as part of a broader study of medieval Paris. His scans revealed extensive underground structures beneath the cathedral that didn't match any known architectural plans. Devereux identified at least 12 distinct chambers in the bedrock below Notre Dame's foundation, arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate design rather than natural formation. When he attempted to publish his findings, he was informed by French authorities that his research violated national heritage protection laws. His data was confiscated, his equipment was seized, and he was banned from conducting any further archaeological work on French soil. Devereux made the mistake of protesting these actions publicly. He gave interviews to Belgian newspapers describing what he called a deliberate cover-up of archaeological evidence. He contacted UNESCO officials arguing that whatever existed beneath Notre Dame was of sufficient historical importance to warrant international protection and study. His activism lasted exactly 3 months before he was arrested at his home in Brussels on charges of illegally exporting antiquities from France. The charges were nonsensical. Devereux had never removed any physical artifacts from France, but they served their purpose. He spent 14 months fighting the charges before they were quietly dropped. By that time, his reputation was irreparably damaged. No university would employ him. No archaeological society would fund his research. He died in 2011, bitter and forgotten. His radar scans of Notre Dame's substructure lost to history. The pattern repeats with disturbing consistency. In 2001, an Italian art historian named Marco Benedetti published a paper analyzing the iconography of Notre Dame's western facade. He identified several symbols that he argued were coded references to Templar beliefs, hidden in plain sight among the cathedral's more conventional Christian imagery. His evidence was compelling, side-by-side comparisons of Notre Dame sculptures with confirmed Templar artwork showing identical symbolic elements. The Vatican's response was swift and brutal. Benedetti was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. His paper was retracted by the journal that had published it following Vatican pressure on the editorial board. He lost his position at the University of Rome, and when he attempted to continue his research independently, he found that archives throughout Europe suddenly refused him access. Then there is the curious case of Philippe Villeneuve, the historian mentioned earlier whose research into Notre Dame's foundation anomalies was cut short by the fire of 2019. Villeneuve had spent 3 years documenting architectural features that contradicted the official history of the cathedral's construction. He had discovered evidence of pre-existing structures incorporated into Notre Dame's foundation. He had identified construction techniques that suggested knowledge far beyond what 12th century builders should have possessed. And he had compiled a comprehensive analysis of how these anomalies connected to known Templar architectural practices. His scheduled presentation in May of 2019 would have been the culmination of his career, peer-reviewed evidence that Notre Dame was built according to a Templar design. After the fire, Villeneuve disappeared from public view. His research materials were reportedly destroyed in the blaze, though he had stored digital copies in multiple secure locations. Those copies have never surfaced. His university position was quietly terminated during the chaos following the fire. Attempts to contact him by fellow researchers go unanswered. His last known public statement was a brief interview given to a French television station in April of 2019, days before the fire, in which he said, "What we found beneath Notre Dame will rewrite medieval history. The cathedral was never what we thought it was." 2 weeks later, Notre Dame burned, and Villeneuve vanished from academic life. The question that haunts these stories is simple. Why? Why would established academic institutions, government agencies, and religious authorities collaborate to silence researchers pursuing legitimate historical questions? The conventional answer is that these scholars were simply wrong, that their research was flawed, their conclusions unsupported, their methods questionable. But this explanation falls apart under scrutiny. These were not fringe conspiracists or amateur enthusiasts. These were credentialed experts with impeccable academic backgrounds, peer-reviewed publications, and institutional support. Until they asked the wrong questions about Notre Dame. The real answer is far more disturbing. These scholars were silenced because they were right. Each one had uncovered fragments of a truth that powerful institutions have spent centuries concealing. The Knights Templar did influence Notre Dame's construction. They did hide knowledge and artifacts beneath the cathedral. And that knowledge, whatever it contains, remains so dangerous that merely investigating its existence can destroy a career. The scholars who knew too much learned that some historical truths are not meant to be discovered. and those who persist in seeking them will be crushed by forces that operate beyond the reach of academic freedom or historical curiosity. The fire of 2019 wasn't the beginning of this cover-up. It was simply the latest and most dramatic chapter in a campaign of suppression that has lasted for 800 years. At 5:43 in the afternoon on April 15, 2019, a white utility van entered the restricted service area behind Notre Dame Cathedral. Security cameras recorded its arrival. The driver presented credentials that were verified and approved by cathedral security personnel. The van remained parked in the service area for 37 minutes before departing at 6:20. During those 37 minutes, 3 individuals in maintenance uniforms removed 4 large containers from the cathedral's lower access points and loaded them into the van. This occurred 1 hour and 7 minutes before the first fire alarm was triggered. The official investigation makes no mention of this van, these individuals, or these containers. The security footage capturing this activity was among the segments that mysteriously malfunctioned and provided no usable data. The first alarm sounded at 6:50 in the evening. Cathedral security personnel responded within 2 minutes, following standard protocol. They found no signs of fire in the areas indicated by the alarm system. The alarm was attributed to a sensor malfunction, a common occurrence in a building as old and complex as Notre Dame. Security reset the system and returned to their normal duties. This would prove to be a fatal delay. While guards were investigating the false alarm, the real fire was already spreading through the cathedral's attic structure, a vast wooden framework that had stood untouched for over 800 years. By the time the second alarm triggered at 6:55, flames were already visible from outside the cathedral. By 7:05, when firefighters arrived, the roof was fully engulfed. The Paris Fire Brigade responded with extraordinary speed and force. 400 firefighters, dozens of engines, aerial ladder trucks, and specialized equipment converged on Notre Dame within the first hour. Their primary objective was to prevent the fire from spreading to the cathedral's iconic towers, where the collapse of one could trigger a catastrophic chain reaction, destroying the entire structure. What firefighters encountered that night defied their training and experience. The fire behaved in ways that structural fires should not behave. It jumped across gaps that should have served as natural fire breaks. It burned with intensity in areas where there was minimal combustible material. And most mysteriously, it left certain sections completely untouched despite being surrounded by inferno on all sides. Commander Jean-Claude Gallet led the firefighting operation. In his official report filed 3 days after the fire, he described a textbook response to a structural fire in a historic building. But in private conversations with fellow firefighters, conversations that were leaked to French media in 2021, Gallet told a very different story. He described finding doors in the lower levels that had been forced open from the inside. He recalled discovering ventilation systems that appeared to have been deliberately tampered with to increase airflow and feed the flames. He mentioned encountering locked gates that should have been accessible for emergency response but had their keys removed. And he expressed deep suspicion about the pattern of the fire's spread, which suggested multiple points of origin despite official conclusions of a single accidental ignition. The timeline of the fire's progression reveals anomalies that structural engineers have struggled to explain. At 7:15, flames were concentrated in the attic above the main nave. By 7:30, fire had spread to the transept crossing, where the spire was located. At 8:03, the spire collapsed in a moment captured by countless cameras and witnessed by thousands of horrified onlookers. But here is where the timeline becomes suspicious. At 8:20, firefighters reported new outbreaks of intense fire in the northern tower, separated from the main fire by stone walls and a significant gap. At 8:45, flames appeared in the southern tower despite no obvious pathway for fire to have traveled there. The official explanation attributes these outbreaks to falling embers and radiant heat. Multiple fire experts have stated that this explanation is implausible given the distances involved and the protective barriers present. While the world watched the cathedral burn from outside, a different operation was unfolding in the crypts below. firefighters attempting to access lower levels to check for fire spread and protect valuable artifacts reported encountering cathedral officials who denied them entry to certain areas. These officials claimed that the vaults in question were structurally unstable and posed collapse risks. But the firefighters noted that these same officials were themselves entering and exiting these supposedly dangerous areas, carrying sealed containers and document cases. When questioned about evacuating church property, the officials stated they were following pre-established emergency protocols for preserving the most valuable and irreplaceable items. Yet the items they were removing were not the famous relics housed in Notre Dame's treasury: the crown of thorns, fragments of the true cross, sacred vestments. Those artifacts remained in their usual locations until firefighters rescued them hours later. Whatever was being evacuated from the lower vaults was something else entirely. The fire reached its peak intensity between 8:30 and 9:15 in the evening. During this 45-minute window, temperatures in the attic structure exceeded 1,200 degrees Celsius. At such temperatures, everything organic should have been reduced to ash. Stone should have shown significant heat damage and fracturing. Metal should have melted or deformed. Yet when investigators examined the cathedral's lower levels weeks later, they found areas that showed no heat damage whatsoever despite being directly beneath the most intense burning. The stone vaults that formed the ceiling of the main cathedral space had protected the interior from the inferno above. This much is undeniable. But those same vaults should have absorbed and radiated enormous heat into the spaces below. Instead, temperature sensors in certain lower chambers recorded peak temperatures of less than 60 degrees Celsius, barely above normal room temperature. This thermal anomaly has never been adequately explained. Some engineers theorized that air currents created by the fire drew heat upward and away from certain areas. Others suggested that the stone vaults possessed thermal properties not fully understood. But several independent analysts have proposed a more disturbing explanation: that someone had installed modern fire suppression equipment in specific chambers beneath Notre Dame, equipment that activated during the fire to protect particular areas while allowing the rest of the cathedral to burn. This theory is supported by peculiar details in post-fire photographs showing pipes and equipment in the lower crypts that don't appear in pre-fire documentation. When questioned about this equipment, cathedral officials stated it was part of a recent upgrade to the fire safety system, but no records of such an upgrade have ever been produced. By 11:30 that evening, firefighters had gained control of the blaze. The structure was saved. The towers stood intact. But the roof was gone, destroyed completely. The spire had collapsed. And an 800-year legacy of wooden framework, some of it dating to Notre Dame's original construction, had been reduced to charred beams and ash. The world saw this as a tragedy barely averted, a historic monument gravely wounded but surviving. What the world didn't see was the systematic removal of materials from the lower vaults, an operation that continued under cover of firefighting operations until nearly 3 in the morning of April 16th. Witnesses in the streets surrounding Notre Dame that night reported seeing vehicles entering and leaving the secure perimeter long after the fire was extinguished. Some of these vehicles bore Vatican diplomatic plates. Others had no markings at all. Security footage from nearby buildings captured some of this activity, but most of the useful angles were obscured by smoke or the strategic positioning of fire equipment. One video, posted briefly to social media before being removed, showed individuals in clerical dress loading boxes into a truck at 2:37 in the morning. The individuals were not firefighters. They were not police. They were not official investigators. They were removing something from Notre Dame under cover of darkness while the world's attention remained focused on the damaged cathedral. The final count of what was lost in the fire remains deliberately vague. Official inventories list damaged artwork, destroyed furniture, and the catastrophic loss of the historic roof structure. But nowhere in these inventories is there mention of documents, manuscripts, or archival materials. The official position is that all such materials were stored in areas that survived the fire intact or were successfully evacuated during the emergency. Yet cathedral staff have spoken anonymously of entire sections of the lower archives that were emptied in the days following the fire, their contents transferred to unknown locations. Requests to inspect these archives or verify their contents have been denied on security and preservation grounds. The materials removed that night, whether during the fire, before it, or in its immediate aftermath, have disappeared into a void of official silence and institutional denial. The reconstruction of Notre Dame began with remarkable speed. Within days of the fire, French President Emmanuel Macron pledged to rebuild the cathedral within 5 years, an ambitious timeline that experts called impossible. Donations poured in from around the world, nearly €1 billion in the first week alone. Architectural firms competed for contracts. Engineers proposed innovative techniques to restore what had been lost. But beneath this public display of determination and generosity, a very different reconstruction was taking place. One that had nothing to do with restoring damaged stones or rebuilding the wooden roof. This reconstruction was about permanently erasing evidence that had survived 8 centuries only to become too dangerous to preserve any longer. The official reconstruction plan called for extensive archaeological surveys before any restoration work could begin. Ground-penetrating radar, structural assessments, documentation of every stone and timber. This is standard practice for historic preservation, and on the surface, everything appeared to follow proper protocols. But the archaeological teams selected for this work were chosen with unusual care. Researchers who had previously questioned official narratives about Notre Dame were systematically excluded. Independent observers were denied access, and the surveys themselves were conducted under conditions of extraordinary secrecy, with results classified as sensitive architectural data not available for public or academic review. In August of 2019, for months after the fire, workers began excavating damaged sections of the cathedral's foundation to assess structural integrity. What they found, according to leaked reports from construction workers who spoke anonymously to French media, were chambers that had been deliberately filled with concrete in the immediate aftermath of the fire. These weren't damaged areas requiring stabilization. These were intact underground spaces that someone had decided to seal permanently. When workers asked their supervisors about the purpose of this concrete work, they were told it was part of emergency structural reinforcement conducted during firefighting operations. But firefighters who were present that night have stated categorically that no concrete was poured during or immediately after the fire. Someone sealed those chambers later, once everyone had left and attention had shifted away from the site. The reconstruction timeline itself reveals suspicious priorities. The wooden roof framework, which captured public attention and emotional investment, became the focus of restoration debates. Should it be rebuilt exactly as it was, using medieval techniques and oak timber? Or should modern materials and methods be employed? These questions dominated media coverage and architectural discussions for months. Meanwhile, work on the cathedral's lower levels proceeded with virtually no public oversight or commentary. New concrete foundations were poured. Drainage systems were upgraded. Access points were reconfigured. And in the process, any remaining evidence of Templar construction or hidden chambers was being systematically obliterated beneath layers of modern infrastructure. Architectural historian Dr. Sophie Laurent attempted to gain access to the reconstruction site in September of 2020. Laurent had spent 15 years studying medieval building techniques and had legitimate academic interest in documenting Notre Dame's original construction methods before they were altered by restoration work. Her access request was denied. When she appealed the decision, citing her credentials and research history, she was informed that all access to the site required approval from a special committee that included representatives from the French Ministry of Culture, the Paris Archbishop's Office, and unnamed Vatican officials. Laurent's name never made it past the initial screening. She later learned through colleagues that her previous publications on Templar architectural influence had flagged her as unsuitable for involvement in Notre Dame's reconstruction. The parallels to historical patterns of suppression are impossible to ignore. Just as the Templars themselves were destroyed when they accumulated too much knowledge and power, just as scholars who questioned official narratives were systematically silenced, the reconstruction of Notre Dame is eliminating physical evidence that might challenge centuries of carefully maintained lies. The fire created an opportunity that institutional powers could not pass up, the chance to rebuild Notre Dame not as it was, but as they need it to be. a cathedral purged of inconvenient secrets, a monument to faith that no longer harbors evidence of the truths that faith has spent 800 years denying. Consider what we know has been lost or hidden. Marcel Dubois discovered manuscripts detailing Templar knowledge that predated Notre Dame's construction. Those manuscripts were seized and disappeared into Vatican archives. Catherine Moreau documented architectural evidence proving Templar influence on the cathedral's design. Her research was discredited and her career destroyed. Henri Devereux's ground-penetrating radar revealed extensive underground chambers. His data was confiscated and he was banned from further research. Philippe Villeneuve was preparing to present definitive proof of pre-existing Templar structures beneath Notre Dame. The cathedral burned 3 weeks before his scheduled presentation. Each piece of evidence, each researcher, each discovery has been systematically neutralized. And now the reconstruction ensures that no future researcher will ever have the opportunity to verify what these scholars found. The cosmic irony is almost poetic in its cruelty. Notre Dame was built by the Templars to preserve their secrets through centuries of persecution. They succeeded beyond imagination. Their hidden chambers, their encoded architecture, their buried manuscripts survived for 800 years. They outlasted the medieval period, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. They survived wars, revolutions, and centuries of religious and political upheaval. But they could not survive the modern age, where technology makes secrets increasingly difficult to keep and institutional powers have tools for erasure that medieval authorities could never have imagined. The fire of 2019 was not the beginning of this erasure. It was the culmination of decades of preparation for the moment when secrecy would finally be replaced by permanent destruction. But perhaps the Templars anticipated even this. Perhaps they understood that no hiding place is truly permanent, that eventually every secret faces discovery or destruction. If so, they may have prepared for this eventuality. The manuscripts that Dubois discovered mentioned other locations, other repositories of knowledge scattered across Europe. The architectural plans that Moreau documented suggested a network of hidden sites, each containing pieces of a larger puzzle. The encoded symbols that researchers have identified in Notre Dame appear in other medieval buildings, suggesting a system of preservation far more extensive than a single cathedral. If the Templars were as sophisticated as the evidence suggests, they would not have placed all their secrets in one location, no matter how secure they believed that location to be. This possibility terrifies institutional authorities more than anything else. It means the fire at Notre Dame, rather than ending the threat of revelation, may have simply moved the battlefield. Researchers who might have spent careers focused on Notre Dame alone will now expand their search. Technologies that revealed hidden chambers beneath the cathedral can be applied to other medieval sites. The pattern of suppression and silence that has been so effective for centuries begins to look like evidence in itself. Proof that something worth hiding still exists somewhere. The destruction of evidence at Notre Dame may ultimately draw more attention to the larger question of what the Templars knew and where else they might have hidden it. Today, Notre Dame stands partially reconstructed, a construction site surrounded by barriers and security. The projected completion date has been pushed back multiple times, with officials citing pandemic disruptions, material shortages, and technical complications. But the delays serve another purpose. They provide additional time for the permanent sealing of anything that might still pose a threat to official narratives. When the cathedral finally reopens to the public, it will be presented as a triumph of restoration, a phoenix risen from the ashes. Millions will visit, awed by the craftsmanship and moved by the resilience of this historic monument. What they will never see, what they will never be told, is what was deliberately destroyed beneath their feet to ensure that certain questions would never be answered. The truth about the Knights Templar, about what they discovered in Jerusalem, about what they hid beneath Notre Dame, remains as elusive as ever. Perhaps more so now that the physical evidence has been systematically eliminated. But the questions persist. The pattern of suppression is too obvious to ignore. The destruction of careers, the confiscation of research, the convenient timing of the fire, the suspicious of the reconstruction. All of it points to secrets so dangerous that tremendous resources and institutional coordination are deployed to keep them hidden. What knowledge could be so threatening that it requires this level of protection? What truth could justify 8 centuries of lies? The ashes of Notre Dame hold no answers, but they pose the most important question. If there was nothing to hide, why did they burn it all?